I had always written to say as much as I could, but basically to entertain, which I think is what writers do. Even the best of writers write to entertain on some level. And of course I wanted this book to be gripping, but I had never written anything that I cared so much about. And as difficult as the subject can be at moments, it's very exhilarating to write about something you care about so much. And I really wanted to get it right. And you know, I was writing about a crisis. I was writing about a family under siege in a crisis. Myself, my family, my daughter, what was happening to us inside while this crisis was occurring, and how we behaved and how we survived. It was a little bit like writing about a storm, you know, when you go on a mountain trip and you get caught in a tremendous storm, and are you going to make it or not? It was that kind of a story. And I think the greatest thing to me was to get rid of kind of the ornamentation that I used to give to my writing, the kind of expensive cloth I would put around my scenes, thinking that this was the best writing, when actually I have no patience for that anymore in myself or in anyone else.
You don't really believe in it, or?
I just don't. Yeah, I think I've arrived at a kind of a writing, for better or for worse, that wants to go right to the heart of experience. And if you can't get to the heart of it, at least you're shooting at the heart of it.
Sounds like you have changed the way you read too.
I have changed the way I read. Yes, yes.
You demand bigger authenticity, or?
Yeah, and
Could you say
directness,
that?
and less bullshit. You know, less sort of showing off. I'm less in love with style than I am with directness, which is in the end the hardest style, I think. But it's not something you can learn. You know, I think my writing was good enough before. It was certainly publishable. It was certainly readable. It was certainly, you know, digestible. But I feel as if everything I wrote before this book was somehow slightly false.
Giving interview after interview about this subject, do you feel that sometimes you're talking about someone else than your own life, or are you still connected with that summer and the horrors, so to speak, or are you free?
No, I'm still connected to it. I can still talk about it with great conviction. But sometimes, depending on the interview, when someone asks me about the writing of the book, I get a little more excited, because I really like that question. I don't get that question very often. I like that question. Sometimes I feel it's a little exhibitionist, you know? On the other hand, I understand that the story can't be universal if it isn't personal at the same time. So sometimes I feel as if I'm listening to myself from far away. And it's like, oh, that's me speaking, saying these things, but I'm a little removed from it, because, you know, when you do 8 or 9 interviews in a day. On the other hand, I'm very gratified by people's, as I told you before we started talking on camera, I'm very, you know, I'm very moved by the people's curiosity and kind of hunger about the experience to know more. So, in the end, I like it, you know, even if it's a little sometimes repetitive.
I'm curious to know how it must be hard to start with a new book after having written about something so... I mean, you've gone into the core of the human existence, so to speak.
Yeah.
How do you go from there in your writing?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question, because, and the reason I went to the core was because the subject demanded that I go to the core. And as I was saying before, I didn't always go to the core. So the subject demanded I go to the core, and that's the problem. That's the great challenge, to have another subject that engages you in your whole being, and in your and where language and soul sort of meet.
When we hear about people's experiences or people's traumas, we try to understand them and try to listen, but it's very hard to really understand fully what they've been through.
Mm-hmm.
Has this experience changed your way of listening to other people?
As far as having more compassion as a person in general, not from the book, but just in general, I think I do. I actually think I do. I think I really notice when people have something they're struggling with, like a handicap. For instance, it really upsets me. I live near Broadway, on the Upper West Side in Manhattan. Up in the residential part of Broadway, but still in Manhattan, you know, like I live on 108th Street. And Broadway is very wide, you know, and there's an island in between, and to cross it, it's like out here, to cross it, you have to cross the island. And if you're a little older, or if you have children or something, it takes 2 traffic lights to get across. And I find I'm furious about this. Why can't they have a slower traffic light? I can't stand it that elderly people have to stand out in the cold longer. That kind of thing. I feel that about them, whereas before I would just be running past them, happy to be able to get across the street faster. And those kind of small things, I find myself very attuned to, the kind of small struggles that people have to go through just to get through a day. In that sense, and I'm happy for that. I'm happy for feeling that.
Fascinating. And also another thing that you sometimes hear from people who have gone through traumas is that other people are waiting for a catastrophe, and that makes our lives nervous because we're waiting for a catastrophe. Whereas the person who has been experienced a trauma, the catastrophe has already happened, so to speak.
Yes.
So that cuts away a lot of our the nervousness of the human existence.
Yes. You're expecting the shoe to drop at some point, because you know no one escapes catastrophe at some point or another, right? And then, of course, there's the ultimate catastrophe that we're all waiting for, which is our disappearance. And but actually, people who have been through trauma, and I'm not sure that my experience with Sally, I would be reluctant to give it the status of the really great traumas. It was a trauma for Sally, and it was deeply impacting, caused a lot of challenge and personal emotion. And I can even say from that experience, but also from people who have been in wartime experiences, people who have been in a cafe when it blew up, people like that. Actually, it's not you dread catastrophe more because you have this psychic drive. The mechanism of trauma is that your psyche wants to relive it over and over again, to kind of get rid of it, to make it less powerful. And this is one of the reasons that trauma is the most successful, perhaps the only truly successful malady, psychological malady that is treated by psychoanalysis. In fact, they found this with Vietnam vets, that in the United States, that they were a post-traumatic stress syndrome is actually positively treated and often put into remission through a reliving of it in psychoanalysis in a controlled state. So actually when catastrophe is struck, catastrophe again feels nearer. And I have this feeling of
you're right.
And I have this feeling of the fragility of life that I didn't have before. I have this feeling of, my God, you know, my most intimate relations are so damn fragile because I saw one of my closest relations vanish like that. And so that idea that we can't take even our most deepest communications for granted. They might not be with us tomorrow. we might not be there tomorrow, has something that I think I've taken away from this and that I didn't really think of before.